Well, welcome everyone to the second lecture on close reading, observing words. And in this lecture, I want to start by looking at George Herbert's poem, The Elixir. Right here, we're just going to be looking at the first stanza. Right here, we've got on the left hand a draft, an early draft of the poem which would become The Elixir. You see right here, here's the first version. And then we have the final version called The Elixir. We're going to see what changes here. Now, George Herbert was a poet of simplicity. He often seems off the cuff, spontaneous. He makes poetry look easy. His poetry, his book of poems, The Temple, is like a garden. And the trick about gardening is to make a garden look wild and effortlessly overgrown. You know, you want the roses overflowing onto the path just a little bit to give that semblance of wilderness. Yet, that's very difficult to achieve in a garden. It actually requires careful pruning and planting and care. And just like an English garden, George Herbert's book of poems, The Temple, looks overgrown, natural, wild, and yet they're carefully crafted poems. And so this is a great example of this. And let's observe some words. So the first version that he wrote reads, "Lord, teach me to refer all things I do to Thee, that I not only may not err, but also pleasing be." You'll notice these are not spelling mistakes, by the way. These are just, spelling was not standardized at this time. So this is the first version. Okay. At the heart here is Paul's injunction that whatever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord, not unto man. This is the idea that Herbert wants to sing in his poem, and that comes from Paul's letter to the Colossians. Here he says it here. Now in this new version we have in the Elixir, "Teach me, my God and King, in all things Thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for Thee." Now, what makes this stanza better than the draft? What makes this final stanza better? Well, notice what it's doing to the ear. For one, this one sounds much more musical. We have interconnecting these four lines, the long E sound, and king, and see, and thee, and things, and anything, and thee. So we have this repetition. Oh, and the most important, teach me, the prayer, the request, the command, the imperative, teach me. And he comes in on the stressed syllable here. Okay, what else has changed? Well, in this earlier version, he refers to God as Lord, teach me to refer. Now the difference is slight. By moving teach me to the beginning, he adds urgency to that request. Teach me, he says. It comes in on that stress right here in the final. But here it goes, Lord, teach me to refer, perhaps. But the word Lord is rather a generic way of addressing God, and Herbert will do this in other poems. However, what's significant about changing Lord to my God and King? Where do we see this phrase, my God and King? It comes from the book of Psalms. Herbert here knows this. And so in changing Lord to my God and King, he is, as it were, putting on the mantle of King David, the poet, of the divine poet, and he's entering into the tradition of divine poetry found in the scriptures. He's making that connection clear. What else is different? Well, he says, my God and King, making the relationship more personal and direct. It's different from just Lord. And even though the two phrases accomplish the same thing in communication, they mean different things. And Herbert is aware of that. But what else is different here? He says, teach me to refer. This is what the original version says. He says refer. This is the main verb. He wants God to teach him to refer. Here, it's to see. Now, what's the difference between refer and see? They're accomplishing the same thing in communication, but it's different. Refer is purely analogical. It's intellectual. It's an abstract concept. To refer something is different from to see. See is visionary. It's dynamic. It's an active sensorial verb connected to the body, but also to the soul, to a visionary power. The metaphor of the eyes of the heart, perhaps. All of that is now charged into this poem with this simple change from refer, purely intellectual, analogical, to see, which is dynamic and sensorial. And what I do in anything to do it as for thee. So we can establish the superiority of this stanza. We know that this is a much better stanza, as Herbert did himself, because of the dynamics of the words, the way the words are interacting with each other here. Far better, far more musical in this stanza than it is in the original stanza. What we've been doing here is observing words and language. Now, observing words and language requires us to look basically at two things. First, we're going to look at diction, which means word choice. What do the individual words do? How are they operating in the sentence? Why does the poet use this word instead of another? Secondly, we're going to look at devices. And this deals not with individual words per se, but rather with the schematic placement of words. What words are doing in relation to each other. Scheme and tropes. And I'll unpack all that. But if you find through the website below, if you're watching this through the course, you have access to the materials, and there's a handout there in which I have listed a number of questions that you can ask in exploring diction and devices. So let's begin with diction. Let's look at plain versus ornate diction. Herbert is a great example of a plain poet, someone who uses plain imagery, as here in his poem, The Flower. Here in this poem, George Herbert describes spiritual depression and the joy that comes after such an experience. After so many deaths I live and write, and once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing. Oh, my only light, it cannot be that I am he on whom the tempests fell all night. Beautiful description of what happens the morning after the dark night of the soul. But notice the diction, the imagery here. It's natural, it's plain. He says, once again, I relish versing. Relish means to really enjoy or to savor. Versing is a folksy way of saying composition, composing poetry. So once again, after this period of depression, he is revived and he loves poetry. Samuel Taylor Coleridge loved George Herbert for this very reason. He has simple diction and he's so sincere. Coleridge writes in a letter how he loved this particular phrase, relish versing. Herbert could have said, and it would have been bland to have said, once again I like writing poetry. Or he could have been highfalutin and said, once again I love the muse. But it was sincere and simple. It was plain to say, and relish versing. Once again, once more, I relish versing. Diction here is so honest and real. So we've seen plain diction. Now let's look at ornate diction through ornate imagery. Here we have just 4 lines from Robert Herrick's devotional poem, To God. Robert Herrick's not known for his devotional poetry. We read some of his Cavalier lyrics in the last lecture. But here we have a specimen from Noble Numbers, his collection of devotional poetry. And what kind of imagery do we have here? We have ornate, or decorated imagery. He says, with golden censers and with incense, here, before thy virgin altar I appear, to pay thee what I owe, since what I see in or without, all belongs to thee. All right, what do we notice about the words chosen here? With golden censers. The speaker of this poem, like an Old Testament priest about to offer sacrifice, going into a temple with censers which have the incense burning in them, the incense rising, approaching the altar. He appears, coming into God's presence. And it's a very different kind of imagery. It's ornate, it's decorated, it's taken from the high church liturgy, it's taken from Old Testament rites. It's a very ornate imagery. So these are two differences. In Herbert, we have the natural, the plain, the sincere. Here in Herrick, we have the ornate, the decorous, and the reverent. Now, it's not to say that the plain style is better than the ornate, or the ornate better than the plain. Both are appropriate in different contexts, but it's just something to keep an eye on as you're exploring the diction of a poem. What is the imagery? Is it simple? Is it natural? Is it decorated? Now let's talk about brevity and length. I want to draw our attention to two American poets. One, Emily Dickinson, the master of brevity and concision. And then we're going to see another American poet who could not be more opposite than Dickinson. So length is another way of discussing diction. I love what William Logan said of Emily Dickinson, that she thinks in metaphor the way other people think in terms of dollars and cents. She is revealingly unrevealing as Shakespeare's sonnets. I'll tell you how the sun rose, a ribbon at a time. The steeples swam in amethyst. The news, like squirrels, ran. The hills untied their bonnets. The bobolinks begun. Then I said softly to myself, that must have been the sun. You notice that incisive metaphor, the crisp personification here. Emily Dickinson is describing the sunset in metaphoric but concise words. She's brief. Now, to be both figurative and brief is something of a feat. It's very difficult to do, but she does it often in her poems. Now, the American genius of length is her contemporary Walt Whitman. He is a poet who relishes extension, length, almost to the same extent that Milton did, perhaps even more. And his American predecessor, Allen Ginsberg, will take this trick as well in his poetry. Here we have stanza 2 from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Now notice the words. Not just the line length, but also the word length. The impalpable sustenance of me from all things at all hours of the day, the simple, compact, well-joined scheme, myself disintegrated, every one disintegrated yet part of the scheme, the similitudes of the past and those of the future, the glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings, on the walk in the street, and the passage over the river, the current rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away, the others that are to follow me, the ties between me and them, the certainty of others, the life, love, sight, hearing of others. Notice Whitman's catalog of imagery here. It just accumulates as he goes, almost like the river itself, which he's talking about. One adjective, one epithet, one image simply will not do. He's got to crowd in as much as he can, and that's part of the effect of the poem, is to almost overwhelm us with the experience that is quintessentially American just as much as it is Whitman in his style. His poetry, to borrow his language, is like glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings. It's almost like the poem itself becomes like this, and that the lines are holding together an accumulation of imagery. It's decorated, it's length, it's extended. And so this is a feature of Whitman's diction here. I mean, look at the polysyllabic words, the many-syllabled words. Impalpable, sustenance, disintegrated. All of it kind of rushes on in a liquid grace, as it were. And he achieves this extravagance partly through length of diction. Now let's look at another way of talking about diction. We've seen plain versus the ornate. We've seen brevity versus length. Let's look at English root words, English diction versus Latin diction. And here is a portion of lines from William Cowper's The Task. It's from The Winter Evening. Now, English diction draws on those words that come from Old English or Anglo-Saxon origin, generally Germanic origin. And you'll see here that William Cowper blends both Old English root words and Latin root words. The thing about Latin is that most of those words are fluid, liquid. They also are more philosophical. I mean, Latin for many years was the language of the church. It was the language of Rome, of poetry, of philosophy, of big ideas. And if you wanted to say anything important, you had to use the Latin language. And so you'll still see people preferring the Latin word when they want to sound fancy instead of the Germanic or the Old English word. We'll see he uses both here. Not sumptuously adorned, nor needing aid, like homely featured night of clustering gems. A star or two just twinkling on thy brow suffices thee, save that the moon is thine no less than hers, not worn indeed on high with ostentatious pageantry, but set with modest grandeur in thy purple zone, resplendent less, but of an ampler round. Cowper here is describing what or who? Homely featured night. Describing night not as something sumptuously adorned, which is something greatly decorated, but as homely featured. Now look, this word homely comes from the Old English word ham, which means home. This is Old English root. What else is Old English root? Night. Nicht. That's Old English root. A star or two just twinkling on thy brow. Star comes from the Old English steora. Just twinkling on thy brow. This is also Old English root. Bru. Suffices thee, save that the moon is thine no less than hers. Moon. That is also Old English. Mona. Old English root. So you see, Old English is earthy. It's textured. It's brief. Tends to be monosyllabic, while the Latin words tend to be polysyllabic. But the effect here is to describe the night as homely, as simple. And he's using Old English diction to do it, which is significant. Now let's look at Latinate diction from a contemporary of Cowper, Edward Young. This is from his Night Thoughts, book 3. Look at some Latinate diction here. See if you can hear it. Are there demurring wits who dare dispute this revolution in the world inspired? Ye train Pierian, to the lunar sphere, in silent hour address your ardent call for aid immortal, lest her brother's right. She, with the spheres harmonious, nightly leads the mazy dance, and hears their matchless strain, a strain for gods, denied to mortal ear. First of all, what is he describing here? He's describing what was called the music of the spheres. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras theorized that because the planets correspond to musical intervals, the way they rotate around supposedly the Earth, the way they correspond to musical intervals means that you should be able to hear their sounds. And he theorized that only the gods could hear the planets moving. He didn't understand why we couldn't, because they're such big planets. So it was this idea that out there in space, the mazy dance of the spheres creates a harmony. But look at the diction here. Revolution. Notice any word really with T-I-O-N is a Latin root. World inspired. Another Latin word comes from a root in Latin which means to breathe. Lunar. See, he doesn't say moon, that would have been too plain, too English. He says lunar sphere. It's almost like he's at pains trying not to say moon. He wants to say lunar sphere to give it this kind of grandeur that Latin words often give. These Latinate words give it a sense of grandeur, but it also gives the lines a kind of liquid grace. Latin words rise and fall on the ear, and it gives it this fluidity. And Young achieves this partly through the use of predominantly Latin nouns. Now, let's look at an example of the simple versus the grand style. Moving on here, we have just a passage. This is in prose, but it's very poetic. The King James Bible, the Bible in general, is often praised for its simple style, which achieves a sublimity. Longinus talks about how the simple style is best suited for the sublime, this awe-inspired experience, and it's almost through its understatement. Now, this is from the Gospel of Mark describing Christ's baptism. And straightway coming out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven, saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. It is something grand in that simplicity, which might seem oxymoronic since we're trying to talk about the grand style and the simple style, but this is simplicity. Notice the words, the constructions, the phrasing. All of it is simple to communicate one grand idea. The diction here is easy, natural, and concise. Now let's turn to the grand style, which is often lengthy, lofty, and extended. John Milton achieves this in Paradise Lost in a number of passages, but here's one very famous, beautiful passage from the opening of Book 3. To get this full effect, you really have to be coming from Book 2, where it ends with Satan hieing, running almost breathlessly, and then you burst in on this first opening line, and the contrast of that helps achieve this grand style. But listen to how this goes. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn, or of the eternal co-eternal beam, may I express thee unblamed? It's a question that many poets, many religious poets, ask themselves. Samuel Taylor Coleridge will ask this of himself in the Aeolian harp. May I express thee, so high a subject, unblamed. Why, since God is light, and never but in unapproached light dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in thee bright effluence of bright essence increate. See how he's moving the passage along towards that conclusive period. And then he immediately picks it up again, right here. Or hear'st thou rather, pure ethereal stream, whose fountain who shall tell? Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert, and at the voice of God, as with a mantle didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep, one from the void of formless infinite. I mean, that is just a powerfully compelling passage. It's grand, it's lofty. It hardly needs any commentary from me to explain what the passage is doing in terms of grandiosity. I mean, just look at this simple simile. At the voice of God, with a mantle, as with a mantle, or with a piece of clothing that you might throw over something, often having prophetic significance in Old Testament text. As with a mantle didst invest the rising world of waters, dark and deep, one from the void, a formless, infinite. Talking about the moment of creation in which light came on the scene. Very moving and grand. So these are ways of looking at poetic diction. These are ways of observing words. What are the words doing in the poem? and how are they operating with each other. Next, let's move to schemes and tropes. We're going to move into devices now that we've seen diction. Let's talk about device. Device falls under schemes or tropes. Now, a scheme is concerned with the placement or the pattern of words within a line, sometimes with balance or repetition. A trope has to deal with a figurative departure, like a metaphor or a simile. Let me give you an example of schemes of balance. Old Testament poetry. Poetry of the Bible tends to be structured schematically, not by rhymes, but through parallel, repetition, and antithesis. So let's look at parallelism. This is from Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Now, a parallelism is the repetition of an idea within a succession of lines, or similar ideas. Here we have the idea: the blessed man is one who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth. So do you see how that idea of what the blessed man does not do is repeated twice here with a different verb? He doesn't walk, he doesn't stand, he doesn't sit. And notice how those verbs are getting stiller and stiller. First he's walking, then he's standing, then he's sitting. So this here is one example of a parallelism. We have two with this negation here, walks not. You notice that it's all in the negative. This is repeated again here. Nor standeth, nor sitteth. So at the repetition of certain words at the beginning of successive lines, that's called anaphora. So far we have learned two schemes. First, parallelism, the repetition of an idea within successive lines, and anaphora, the repetition of a word at the beginning of successive lines. Here, nor. Here, another parallelism. But, you notice this turn here. First we hear that the blessed man, what he doesn't do, but this is what he does do. His delight is in the law of the Lord. There's the one iteration. And in his law doth he meditate day and night. There's a repetition of that, or an explanation of that. Another parallelism here. Again, here, what shall the blessed man be? He shall be like a tree planted. There's a simile, which is a trope. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth fruit in his season. Okay, there's one complete idea. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. There's really a repetition of that. Here we have the idea explained figuratively through simile, and here the idea is repeated in the scheme of parallelism with an explication. Here another turn. See, the ungodly are not so, but are, simile, like the chaff, which the wind drives away. Chaff was the part of the husk on the wheat that was useless, and so you would blow it away. It would be good for nothing. What you want is that kernel of wheat. Therefore, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Two ideas repeated here, another parallelism. And then what do we get here? For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. We have a contrast. It's a parallelism of opposites called an antithesis. And this is the third scheme that's important. You'll often see this at the end of many of Shakespeare's sonnets, the figure of antithesis. You'll snap shut with that contrasting image. Lord knows the way of the righteous, but, opposite image, the way of the ungodly shall perish. So you see how this poem is organized schematically through parallelism, through anaphora, through antithesis. It helps balance the poems. Instead of operating in terms of corresponding sounds, like with a rhyme scheme, Hebrew poetry, the Psalms, operate through the rhyming of ideas and through the interplay of contraries and likenesses. Let's look at schemes of sound. So that was schemes of balance. We're going to look now at schemes of sound. And this is the beginning of Matthew Arnold's Dover beat. There are 3 or 4 schemes here. See if you can hear the repetition of certain sounds. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand, glimmering and vast, out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. Begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulous cadence flow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. This, like the elegy written in the country churchyard by Thomas Gray, is a good example of how the poem is enacting the sounds it's expressing. Now, what are some schemes to note here? One thing you might notice is alliteration. Of course, the repetition of the first letter of certain words. We have the G here. We have the F here, fair, French coast. With the cliffs, this is not alliteration, but it's repetition of a consonant. We have also this S alliteration, sweet, spray, the sea. All right. The alliteration is one scheme of sound, but what else do we have? We also have the repetition of vowel sounds, which is called assonance. Look here. Listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. Begin and cease, and then again begin. We have the E sound along begin going with cease, E, E. Chiming with fling, begin here again, and bring, eternal, all linking there. What else do we have? We have the repetition of the I, the in sound, at the end of begin. In, and then again, begin. You notice how the sounds are enacting the motion of the waves, the sound of the waves on the pebbles, drawing in, retreating. And the sound is interlinked. Tremulous, cadence, slow. Of course, this vowel here slows us down. And bring the eternal note of sadness in again. That note of sadness here, in. This is an example of assonance. But notice too, we have a particular kind of consonants. We have the S here at the alliteration, but not just in alliteration, at the end of words too. Waves, draw back, cease, and in the middle of words, cease. At the beginning, at the end, tremulous, slow. This is a special kind of consonants called sibilants. It's the S sound repeated throughout, ringing with this note, sadness. It's a panalepsis of sound, beginning and ending with S. So you see how this scheme of sound through alliteration, assonance, consonants, and sibilants all work to make the lyric poem a sound for the ear, a music of its own. All right? We've seen schemes of balance. We've seen schemes of sound. Let's now turn our attention to tropes, figurative departures from the literal. What a good example here is John Donne's Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness. Now we're going to start with this stanza. Stanza 1. John Donne is sick. He was sick most throughout his 40s and 50s, often having bouts of fever that confined him to his bed, and on one occasion he thought he was dying. He wrote this. Since I am coming to that holy room, where, with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. The metaphor here is of coming to that holy room. What is that? Heaven, where he shall be made thy, God's music. I come, I tune the instrument at the door. What is the instrument? It's a metaphor for the soul. He's tuning it. He's making sure everything's right before he meets God. What is the door? It's another metaphor for death, the door of death that he's going to be passing through. What I must do then, when I am in death, think here, before. Next stanza. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, perfectum fabris, by these straits to die. In this stanza, another metaphor is working. He's transformed himself and his physicians. You notice a patient will be sick on the bed, the doctors will be standing over. It's the same image that one has of cosmographers, or travelers, when they're looking at a map and they're trying to read the map to see where they're supposed to go. John Donne is saying, I have become the map, and my physicians are like map readers, or they are map readers. So that's also a metaphor. And by the way, perfectum fabris, by the wearing away of fever, or by death of fever, by these straits to die. What is a strait? There are two senses of the word here. In some way, strait means an illness or a narrowness or some kind of limitation, like a sickness. But it also means a passage by which a ship will make its way. So in a way, this is a pun, which is also a trope. This particular kind of pun, by the way, is called antenna-classes, but we can just say that it's a pun entertaining two senses of the word. It works both with his metaphor as him as a map, and it also works in terms of his sickness, which is limiting him. I joy that in these straits I see my west. For, though their currents yield return to none, what shall my west hurt me? As west and east, in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection. So now he's turned this idea of the map into a metaphysical conceit. You know how on a flat map you have the east, the far east corner of the map is exactly where the west corner begins? He's saying, so am I. My beginning is my end. My death already touches the resurrection, the new life. And so in a way, he's already imagined himself as a map of sorts. Is the Pacific Sea my home? Or are the eastern riches? Is Jerusalem, Anion, and Magellan, and Gibraltar? All straits, and none but straits, are ways to them, whether where Japheth dwelt, or Cam, or Shem. Here the pun of the straits is being used again, partly as a metaphor, but also entertaining that double sense by virtue of the pun. Here again we have, in the last two stanzas, we have schemes and tropes. We think, that is, theologians, we think that paradise in Calvary, Christ's cross, and Adam's tree stood in one place. Look, Lord, and find both Adams met in me. As the first Adam's sweat surround my face, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. Now we've already learned what an antithesis is, and here we have really a trifold antithesis. We've got first Adam, last Adam, there's one. Sweat, there's blood. And face, my soul, there's the third. Two opposites are two contrasting ideas put at play in these two lines, schematically. Now in this final stanza we have the figure of paradox, a seemingly contradictory statement. So, in his purple wrapped, receive me, Lord. By these his thorns, give me his other crown. See this antithesis again, or this really juxtaposition of opposites. And as to other souls I preached thy word, be this my text, my sermon to mine own. Therefore that he may raise, the Lord throws down. There we have that paradox of this quotation, that he may raise, he throws down. So that the Lord may raise up again in resurrection, the Lord throws down in death. So we have a nice paradox here. And Donne's poems are often They often hinge on paradoxes because they often entertain the theological paradoxes which characterize Christianity. So this is a good survey into tropes. Hopefully this lecture has given you a way of looking at poems and examining how the individual words are working together, why the poet's using one word instead of another, what the sound of the words are doing, and also how they're placed in relation to one another, and how they sometimes take on multiple meanings through figurative departures from the literal. Next lecture, we're going to be looking at enjoying impressions, really the companion lecture to this one, because while this one we've looked at the individual parts of the poem, of what it is on the page, and what the language is doing, in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at what that is doing to us as we are reading. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.